Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, June 10th. So-called President Joe Biden is on his way to meet with President Vladimir Putin. As a kind of culmination of a series of meetings, which we'll be discussing to some degree today, and more this coming Saturday at 2 p.m., when Mike Billington, who's speaking to us tonight, will be joining Harley Schlanger, Mike Robinson, and Dan Kovalik for a discussion on Saturday. And the idea is to address a matter that requires to be directly addressed. We're going to be doing that throughout this evening. And that is, what does a free citizen of the United States Republic do to act on behalf of the executive of the United States when the executive of the United States has apparently been absented or is occupied by those that don't express, for whatever reason, the actual intent of the Constitution of the United States and the revolution called the American Revolution as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. What do you and I do in that circumstance? Now, this is not an unusual circumstance in America. It's simply an unpleasant circumstance in America, but it's one that has been addressed many times in the past. And the nature of the dynamic process of the American Republican form of government allows, uniquely, people in this country to do what people in other countries can't do. That whenever any government becomes destructive of the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new forms of government. This did not mean, as many people are fond today of saying or thinking, let's change the Constitution, which is a very dicey proposition when you've got a population that has been so intellectually reduced as this population has been, particularly in the past 50 years and more generally since the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. So we are not, as a republic and as a citizenry, frankly, at the moment, fit to actually discuss the idea of altering or changing the Constitution of the United States. But there is something that we can do, and there's something that the LaRouche movement was built to do. And that has to do with the concept of doing good. Now, this was something that Vladimir Putin on Tuesday addressed at a conference of social workers, and we called attention to that today in the lead of our briefing, and which goes out to various people around the world. He said in his speech, and this is a quote, "The very values of mercy, love for one's neighbor, and support for those in need bind and consolidate the entire centuries-old history of our people. They constitute the spiritual basis of the traditional religions of Russia. The fundamental aim of life should be to do good." Now, people can speak about the dictator Vladimir Putin, and they can talk about the communist Vladimir Putin, but I defy anybody to find that kind of sentiment expressed in any of the speeches of Joseph Stalin, or for that matter, even Nikita Khrushchev or someone like that. Of course, you might find some verbiage from Mikhail Gorbachev, but from the standpoint of the actual orientation of Russia, the nation of Russia today, this is about the best possible circumstance that the United States has had to negotiate with a Russian leader, including the period of the Second World War since 1945. But we find ourselves intellectually incapable of handling that, apparently. But that's not really true. That's not true because the United States citizenry was prepared over a period of a half century by a set of publications, pamphlets, books, and speeches, as well as actions, including political campaigns, conducted by one individual, Lyndon LaRouche, who was completely relentless in making proposal after proposal after proposal for what exactly to do. Not just what to do all over the world, what to do in Saudi Arabia or in Morocco or in Iran or in Canada or in Israel or in Argentina or in China or in India, everywhere in the world in specific. So there wasn't just the programs for the United States, and it wasn't just what he did around the presidency. It was this relentless writing and formulating and reformulating of ideas and proposals, which was actually an American tradition. And it was something that was exemplified in the case of the United States, the pre-United States, the colonial Commonwealth of Massachusetts, by Cotton Mather, the son of Increase Mather, and one of the major inspirations for Benjamin Franklin. Mather wrote something called Essays to Do Good, and it's a document that particularly Benjamin Franklin used as a kind of calling card from the time that he was first being published back when he was 13 years old, and he called himself Silence Do Good. This notion of doing good, or bona facias, as the name of the book, the Essay to Do Good, is now been directly discussed by Putin. And to say or to try to dismiss this as verbiage, rhetoric, or posturing doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it, because once that sentiment has been expressed, particularly by a nation seen as an adversary, it is the responsibility of the American citizen to represent the presidency of the United States to the extent that that sentiment is responded to by proposals and by actions that are taken by us and intended to therefore shape and influence the presidency. Let me indicate one other thing before we go to Mike, which is that sometime today, a breaking news story was printed in the Washington Post, which expressed alarm that Joe Biden was moving off his intention to go ahead with the Green New Deal. And it stated that Al Gore had called Biden. It said the former vice president urged Biden to stop the plan by Hallia pipeline, which would transport crude oil for export, so forth. Then it says that he gave a warning to Biden to not divert. Gore called Biden to insist on the inclusion of climate policies after the encouragement of John Podesta, former chair of the Liberal Center for American Progress think tank, said people have been concerned that Biden would not see this through. Our job is to make sure Biden doesn't see it through. Our job is to dismantle the entire idea of the Green New Deal. And one of the features of the conference that will be happening in 2 weeks, sponsored by the Schiller Institute, starting on Saturday, June 26th, the second panel, in particular, the afternoon panel, is called "The Truth about the True Science Behind Climate Change: Why the World Needs 7 terawatts of Energy." And it will bring together, it's already going to bring together scientists we haven't announced who's speaking, but we have people from Italy, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from South Africa, from the United States, and we are assembling them, and we're telling them to assemble everybody they know, because it's time for an all-out war on behalf of the human race, and to pick this idea that there are no limits to growth, and that humanity is the universe's greatest known natural resource. Human creativity is the greatest known natural resource in the universe. To state that clearly, boldly, and sharply, and draw a line first in the sand between those who understand that or believe that and those who do not. So this is only one expression of what we are called upon to do. Now, sometimes it's hard to know, and it's hard, the situation is difficult because, of course, the president is to lead. But what happens if the president doesn't? So to discuss that practice and also the policies that are at issue for us in the short term in the United States and around the world going into this summit conference, we're going to have Mike Billington. So, Mike, if you're there, it's time for you to take over and give your briefing.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. So I'm going to review the history of some of Lyndon LaRouche's work over these last 50 years in the context of doing a retrospective on the Trump administration. Now, most of you probably know that Trump spoke publicly for the first time, really, at the North Carolina Republican Party the other day, and unfortunately did not say any of the things I'm going to go through that led me to do a webcast just a few weeks after Trump was inaugurated. This was in March of 2017. And I did a broadcast which was transcribed and put in EIR on March 17th of 2017 called Why the British Hate Trump. And I'm going to go back over some of those ideas and basically answer the question why Trump failed and why, unfortunately, many of Trump's supporters don't understand why he failed, or they fail to understand how he and why he failed. And it has everything to do with Lyndon LaRouche. So the British at that time believed that they had LaRouche and his ideas safely contained through the prosecution of LaRouche in 1989, incarcerating him for 5 years, a number of the rest of his collaborators imprisoned as well, including myself, that they thought that these ideas had been contained both by the prosecution and by the demonization of LaRouche through a puppet media, through a Congress, corrupted Congress, and through harassment of our supporters and so forth. And then Trump appeared. And the reason he was elected, not only by Republicans, but by a large number of Democrats, working-class Democrats and minorities who elected him, had a great deal to do with the fact that he began to express some of the ideas which were very widely associated in this country and around the world with Lyndon LaRouche. So let me go through a few of those. Start, of course, with Russia. As I'm sure you remember, during the campaign, Trump said over and over and over again, it's a good thing to be friends with Russia. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And, of course, if you think back of who had been advocating being friends with Russia, you have to know that it was almost only Lyndon LaRouche throughout all these years. I'll start with 1982 and 1983. Lynn had been organizing for what he called beam defense around the world. We held conferences in countries all over the world saying that the current British policy, backed by the Kissinger people and the Democrats, so-called mutual assured destruction, was the idea that the Russians, or the Soviet Union at that time, and the U.S. Were both armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons aimed at each other, but because we knew that if a nuclear war started, we'd both be eliminated, totally destroyed, that this was called mutual assured destruction, and it was supposed to make sure nobody started a war because everybody would lose. But, of course, this meant that the world would be permanently divided. We wouldn't have the world united around common aims of mankind. Of course, the British and the geopoliticians don't believe there is such a thing as a common aims for mankind. But Lyndon LaRouche did. And he thought that we should push forward in the frontiers of science, the frontiers of human knowledge, and develop space-based systems that could use particle beams, laser beams, other kinds of, at that time, futuristic technologies, which could, in fact, knock out nuclear missiles. And instead of being mutual assured destruction, it would be mutual assured defense. He took this idea to Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. Ronald Reagan was totally intrigued by this idea, made it public that he was intrigued by LaRouche's ideas. He asked LaRouche to begin a back-channel discussion with the Russians, the Soviets, at that time, to get the Soviets to join with Reagan in announcing a joint policy for developing what he called ultimately the Strategic Defense Initiative, and as Reagan said, to make nuclear weapons obsolete. So LaRouche did. He was doing these back channels on behalf of President Reagan. The Russians finally decided to tell Reagan and LaRouche, no, we're not going to do it. We have confidence that we have assets within the United States that won't allow Reagan to launch this kind of science driver. And LaRouche told them at the time that because of the structure of your economy, which is totally focused on massive military defense, and unfortunately leaving the rest of the industrial economy and agriculture to waste, that if you don't join with us on this joint push ahead on the frontiers of human knowledge, that your economy won't survive another 5 years. Well, that was 1983. So Reagan did adopt it. He announced it in 1983. And the Soviet Union did in fact collapse, not in 5 years, but in 6, in 1989. And at that time, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we learned that, in fact, LaRouche's ideas had been being studied extensively by the Russian scientists and Russian economists. LaRouche was in prison at the time, but when he got, because of George Bush, but when he got out in 1994, he immediately was invited to Russia. He went and met with their leading scientists, leading economists, and established very close relations with that faction within Russia. The fact of the matter is that was during the time Yeltsin was running Russia and was inviting all the oligarchs from the UK and the US to come over and steal everything they could. So it was a mess there. But the leading people, who are still our friends, at that time recognized LaRouche's leadership as one of the few people in the West who had some semblance of an idea of what real economics was, based on Lynn's talk about the LaRouche-Riemann economic model. So then later, after the 2008 collapse, LaRouche at that point said the Western financial system is totally bankrupt. It's not going to survive. The only chance we have is for Russia and China and India and the United States, what he called four powers, to come together in a new Bretton Woods meeting to put the existing bankrupt Western banking system through bankruptcy proceedings and restore an American system approach, a Hamiltonian approach, with Glass-Steagall type powers, and we have been fighting for that ever since. So you can imagine when the British heard that Donald Trump wanted to restore friendship with Russia, they went berserk. And they sent their top intelligence operatives, the leaders of the British Empire, Robert Hannigan from the GCHQ, which is their NSA, the head of their intelligence, Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6, and his boy Christopher Steele. I'm sure you remember he's the author of this dodgy dossier that had LaRouche cavorting with Trump cavorting with prostitutes in Moscow and so forth, all this garbage, which they took directly to John Brennan, Jim Clapper, to the Obama intelligence team, who gobbled it up and put it out and launched Russiagate, right, whose purpose was to prevent Trump's effort to rebuild relations between the United States and Russia. Now, Trump refuted that, of course. He said there's no collusion, this is a hoax, this is a fake. That's true. But when they would begin pulling little tricks, like when they said that this guy Skripal, who was the British agent that had, in the KGB that the Russians had caught as a British spy, put him in prison, got everything they needed out of him, and then traded him for a Russian spy in the UK. So he went to live in the UK. The Russians had no need of him anymore. They had nothing to gain. They had nothing to gain from killing him, of course. They had already had him in their power, and they didn't need it. But suddenly he got poisoned by chemical weapons, and, the Russians did it. No evidence. The Russians did it. The Russians did it. So Trump's own cabinet, his own intelligence people, said, yep, the Russians did it. And Trump was suckered into expelling 60 Russian diplomats. Then began this thing about, there was no collusion, but I'm tougher on Russia than anybody else. And that's what the British wanted. And that's what his own cabinet people wanted. So that went on, and that went on. Trump did nothing when the military, which he recognized was a military which had launched the wars in Iraq and other wars, which were, as he said, the worst mistakes in American history, and that these same military were pushing NATO right up to Russia's border, risking nuclear conflict, and he didn't stop them. So I'll come back to that, but let's move on to China. Now, during the campaign, Trump did not praise China. He complained about China, but only because of this massive trade deficit. And interestingly, he didn't blame China. He said China took advantage of the stupid leadership in the United States, and he named not just Obama, but Bush and Clinton, the globalizers, the people who allowed British thinking to take over American policy, where the only thing that mattered was stockholder value and short-term profit. The profit of the nation didn't matter anymore, so we didn't bother protecting our industries or our working people, and we encouraged banks and businesses and industries to go overseas seeking the cheapest possible labor they could. And this was indeed a disaster, and Trump attacked that. But as soon as he got elected, you'll remember this, within weeks, actually, he invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago. They had a very important meeting. And within a few months after that, he went to China and had a tremendous visit to China. Xi Jinping and his wife took Trump and his wife through the Forbidden City. For hours, they talked about each of the pavilions, which was a different time in Chinese history. They talked about this 5,000-year-old Chinese culture, Chinese traditions. And Trump came away extremely impressed. He talked over and over about the great nation of China and the great leader Xi Jinping. People forget that because of all the anti-China hysteria since that time. And then he proceeded to make a trade deal, a very effective trade deal. It was just the beginning, but it began to address the trade imbalance, which again had been created by his predecessors. So let's go back again now. Who before Trump was promoting this connection with China? And again, it's LaRouche. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the first thing Lynn and Helga did was to say, okay, let's end this British division of East versus West, the division of the world. Let's build a new Silk Road, uniting Asia and Europe, bringing China and the European cultures together the way Leibniz wanted to do several centuries earlier. We took this idea to Europe. The Europeans say, no, we want an enemy. We need an enemy image. We're going to keep NATO and keep confronting China and Russia. It went to Russia. Russia was a mess at the time. Under Yeltsin, it was being torn to pieces. But the Chinese responded enormously. Helga personally organized a huge conference in Beijing in 1996. That's a long time ago, on the Silk Road and what they called the Eurasian Land Bridge. And the Chinese had top government representatives there. They were tremendously excited about this, and they basically adopted it, although that was the time of global economic crisis around 97, and things moved rather slowly. But when Xi Jinping came in 2012, and in 2013 announced the new Silk Road, what he called the Belt and Road Initiative, this was quickly recognized by the Chinese as the idea that that Helga and Lynn had presented. And in fact, Helga became known throughout China as the Silk Road Lady. She made many trips there. In 2014, we published this 370-page document called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, encouraging them to look beyond just connecting Eurasia, but moving into the rest of the world, into Africa, South America, and into the United States. And this policy represented, in fact, again, think about what the British thought when they saw Trump, instead of demonizing Russia and China, actually working with Xi Jinping and saying, this is a great country. So at the same time, Trump, again, as he was with Russia, was allowing the military-industrial crowd and his Pompeo and others in his cabinet to badmouth China. He himself never attacked China except on the trade issue. He never went along with Pompeo and these people saying that the demonstrators in Hong Kong were freedom fighters, for instance. He knew that these black-clad, hooded terrorists running around burning down Hong Kong on the payroll of George Soros and the National Endowment for Democracy were the same as the black-clad, hooded terrorists burning down U.S. cities, on the same payroll of Soros and the NED, under the cover of the Black Lives Matter. These were terrorists. And he didn't go along with his cabinet and the Congress who said these were freedom fighters. He knew better. He never went along with the idea that there's genocide in Xinjiang, an absolutely ridiculous idea coming out of Pompeo. All he talked about was the trade deal, and he actually, as I said, he moved towards that. Now, we tried to move Trump away from these people. His FBI chief, Christopher Wray, was running around the United States arresting Chinese and Chinese Americans, leading scientists, professors, and students for the crime of working with Chinese scientists on developing and pushing forward on the frontiers of human knowledge. People working on curing cancer were driven out of their laboratories for daring to spy on America by sharing our secrets about curing cancer with the Chinese. Imagine calling that a secret, curing cancer. And in fact, we were learning more from the Chinese than they were learning from us. But this kind of insanity was going on. We published a pamphlet, many of you probably saw this, called Stop the McCarthyite Witch Hunt Against China and Trump. The point was this wild anti-China hysteria from Pompeo, from Christopher Wray, from Navarro, was an attack on the president. Just as the Russiagate was an attack on President Trump's ties to Russia, this was an attack on his connections to China, to reassert the British imperial division of the world into warring factions. So he didn't repeat these lies, but he didn't stop them. It was only when COVID hit, and I think this is important, when COVID hit in February, March of 2020, Trump at first told the truth. He said, and in fact he repeated this in North Carolina the other day, he said, our cupboard was bare. The state's cupboards were bare. And he didn't spell it out, but what he was saying was what we had been arguing for years, which is that the privatization of healthcare was because of that, we were watching a total takedown of the healthcare capacity of this nation. Hundreds of hospitals were shut down. Production was just on-time production, no stockpiles. We had a situation in which when a pandemic hit, and pandemics will hit, especially when you take down the defenses of a country, we were unprepared. And Trump at first told the truth, and that lasted for over a month. And he praised the way the Chinese had dealt with it, which was, they have a powerful health capacity system and were able to isolate it, test everybody, and stop it. So what happened? Well, the reaction, what happened in the U.S. was a total disaster. We did have no defenses, and it swept through the country. It was a lot of bad policy, and you can argue about who was telling the truth and who was lying and who was sending sick people into to old age homes and so forth. But the fact is our defenses had been taken down. And then finally, unfortunately, one of the big mistakes Trump made, Pompeo convinced him that with an election coming, he had to blame somebody. he had to blame somebody for the COVID disaster in the United States, and he started blaming the China virus and so forth. So that, again, one of the big mistakes. Now, let's move on to the climate hoax. You can imagine what the British thought when Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord. If you haven't read already, we have a mass pamphlet. Hopefully all of you have read this, called The Great Leap Backward. LaRouche Crushes the Green New Deal Fraud. And we just, in fact, ordered another 7,500 of these printed. We want mass circulation of this document to expose the whole Great Reset, Green New Deal, genocide, Malthusian genocide, and the destruction of our industrial economy and everybody's industrial economy, and outright murder in the third world. So one chapter in that, I hope you've read it, documents how the entire Green New Deal was made up and orchestrated by Prince Charles, help from his father, Prince Philip. It was a policy for implementing the British imperial policy of depopulation. Before World War II, they simply called it eugenics, race science. We're the superior race. The black and brown and yellow races are inferior races. We have to discourage their population growth. If there are famines or pandemics, let them go. Don't interfere. This is nature's way of culling the herd, and they're inferior races anyway. So after the war, that didn't sell very well after Hitler used it for the slaughter of the Jews and others. So they switched over to environmentalism. The world can't hold so many people. And then, of course, this morphed into this crazy idea that carbon somehow causes climate change, which is just scientifically a total fraud. But, you know, this when Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord, they went really berserk. This was another major impetus for them to go after Trump with everything they possibly could. They knew this was LaRouche. They knew this was what they thought they had contained by the incarceration and demonization of LaRouche. We published documents, I forget when, 20, 30 years ago, called Becoming Ice Age. As soon as this global warming stuff started, we refuted it scientifically. We worked with leading scientists to show that this was a total fraud, whose only purpose was, again, a fake excuse by the British Empire to impose policies that they believed in for totally other reasons, Malthusian reasons, that we need to keep the population backwards, or actually decrease the population. So, again, this just created a situation in which the British went full steam after Trump. So, but, you know, Trump never questioned the science. All he said was that the Paris Accord was unfair, that we had to shut down our industry faster than other people needed to shut it down. That's all he said. Except finally, about a year and a half ago, he went to a very close friend of ours, many of you know from our conferences, Professor Will Happer, who was formerly the head of the physics department at Princeton, and who formed a national organization, I think it was called the CO2 Coalition, that basically showed that carbon dioxide was the food for our plant life. Carbon dioxide was good. The more the better the agricultural growth in the world. The idea that it was a pollutant was just an insane concept, literally insane concept. And he's gone through these proofs in our conferences to demonstrate that this entire climate change carbon thing is a total fraud. So he brought him in. He brought him in and put him in the National Security Council. We probably had something to do with making that happen. And the idea was that he would hold a public debate, would be televised nationally out of the White House, between Happer and real scientists with these computer programmers who call themselves scientists pushing this climate change hoax. All right? Imagine what would have happened if real science had been presented to the American people from the White House. It would be a different world right now. It didn't happen. And our sources tell us that the same military people, like Mattis and others, who told Trump to drop dead when he said, get out of these damn wars in Afghanistan and Syria, these endless wars. They said, no, Commander-in-Chief, forget it. We're not going to do it. And our understanding is that they're the same people who would not allow Trump to call this debate that would have blown this fake science out of the water. So Happer stuck around for about a year, and he finally went back to Princeton. Now, LaRouche never hedged on the science. It was the science. That was the key, that climate change came about through phases of the sun, galactic matters that had to do with how much cosmic radiation got through the radiation belts, the magnetic belts around the Earth from the sun. That's real science, and it's out there. We're going to be presenting more of it at this conference, by the way. So, the real science was there. Now, another step is the whole globalization story. LaRouche made very famous in America the word globaloney. What was globalization? It was just a nice word for imperialism. It was the idea that we had to take sovereignty away from our other nations, including our own, and submit to a global governing policy, which basically was the British economic system of going out to find the cheapest labor you possibly can. So it led to the destruction of our domestic economy. It created a collapse of sovereignty in Europe with the whole EU and so forth and so on. So Trump came in, and again, he said sovereignty. He said America first. Now, some of you remember that he went to the UN and gave a speech, I think the very first year he was in September. And he said, look, I want America first. Does that mean America über alles? No. It means sovereignty. It means in America, it has to be America first. In China, it has to be China first. In Latin America, it has to be Latin America first. We need to defend our sovereignty. We have to have our citizens who elect people have the right to change policy by unelecting them. And when you have international bodies like the whole Brussels operation over the EU or the Paris Accord and so forth, then basically you've lost your sovereignty, and that's what he was talking about. But so he attacked globalization all the time. But who ran globalization? It was Wall Street that was running globalization. It was Wall Street that had been taken over by the British system, which was, unlike Hamilton, which said you build infrastructure, the government takes responsibility for those things needed to defend the general welfare, the roads, the bridges, the highways, the energy, the hospitals, the schools. That's the government's responsibility, either to do it themselves or make sure it's getting done properly. Well, that was all dropped. Everything was free market, free trade, keep the government out of everything, let Wall Street run the economy. And now, of course, as you know, as was documented in this great leap backwards document, it's literally Wall Street and the City of London running this Green New Deal directly, saying we're going to take over the economic policies. We're going to cut credit to anybody who has carbon emissions. Right? This is literally an example of the British Empire taking over the United States and the world through the empire, which is these banking systems. So Trump didn't attack Wall Street. He made a few noises about the American system. He talked about Alexander Hamilton and the American system a couple of times, but he dropped it. And instead, he said, we're rebuilding the American economy. And there were some improvements in the industrial economy, and there was employment, but it wasn't great. And that's why what he pointed to was Wall Street. He said, see, Wall Street's booming. That proves that we have a great economy, which was, again, one of his terrible mistakes, because that Wall Street bubble was entirely the result of quantitative easing and money printing that was printed up to bail out the banks, not to build the economy. And it's now even worse than that, since the trillions of dollars that have been printed the last couple of years. But this was speculation, and he was praising speculation over production when he pointed to Wall Street. So that's a problem. And then lastly, I'll mention space. One of the great things Trump accomplished was Artemis. We had watched our space program just decimated under Bush and then under Obama. It was a shadow of itself. Not only had we not gone back to the moon, but any chance of doing any major space exploration was undermined by the gutting of the budgets and of the research and the major rockets that we were not building. And Trump came in and said Artemis. And this was an inspiration to our children, to Americans, to people all over the world, that indeed we are not earthbound. We're not earthlings in that sense, that we have a universe to explore. And he said, we're going to go back to the moon. We're going to set up a colony in the moon. We're going to go from there to Mars. And, this inspired people. Now, again, go back to LaRouche. LaRouche, throughout his career, fought to stop the destruction of NASA and to bring the world together around space exploration. Way back in 1988, during a presidential campaign, he did a half-hour paid broadcast throughout the country on network television called The Woman on Mars, which started off with a woman landing on Mars and saying, "Here I am on Mars Station." And he called this a 40-year program for a Mars mission. 40 years. That would have taken us up to 2028. Right? If we'd followed it at that time, we'd be ready to be on Mars by 2028 or maybe even earlier. And ironically, it's really interesting to go back to the slanders against LaRouche in the 80s and 90s when they were going after him and throwing him into prison. Almost every one of the media slanders, calling him a racist, a Nazi, a communist, whatever name they could come up with. But it always included that this guy is obviously crazy because he says we should go to Mars. Yeah, think about that today. But that was always part of the slander, is that he's crazy. He wants to go to Mars. Right? This was the brainwashing that was going on against the American people at the time through the demonization of Lynn and his ideas. Now, but again, there's a problem here with Artemis, which is what? One of the greatest examples of the tremendous benefit of the great nations of the world coming together to work together for a common aim of mankind was the Apollo-Soyuz cooperation. It was at the peak of the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union joined hands scientifically and literally and built an international space station, went together, astronauts and the Russian, what's the Russian name? Cosmonauts, together. And in fact, when the U.S. stupidly let its rocket program so deteriorate that we couldn't even take people to our own space station anymore, the Russians graciously said, "We'll take you. Come along on our Soyuz rockets." And they did. They still are, actually. Right? So this was one of the things that gave the entire world a sense that if the world works together, we can achieve great things. But is Russia part of the Artemis program? It's not. China was left out before because of stupid politicians in America, and it's left out now, and the Russians are left out. This won't work. Right? It simply won't work. So this is a situation, and in fact, the irony is that the Chinese are now doing things that we can't do. They're not exactly ahead of us in space technology. But they did land on the other side of the moon. They were able to go to Mars and do all three of getting there, having a lander, and having a rover all in one trip the first time. And think about what would happen if we had the U.S. and the Russians and the Chinese working together. I mean, we'd be there already, Elon Musk sure as hell wants to work with the Chinese. He loves working with them on his electric cars. That's where he's selling most of his things. And then lastly, I'll just say what you already know. Trump campaigned to end these damn endless wars, He said the Iraq invasion was the greatest mistake in the history of America. It's true. He said we have to end these endless wars. There's no purpose in being there. And as I said before, the Mattis and McMaster and these people, when the commander-in-chief, that's the president, tells them to get out, they said go to hell. So people say, oh, well, it's the deep state. Now, what's the deep state? I know a lot of people told me when I would brief them on these ideas, they'd say, well, look, you can't blame it on Trump's cabinet. He hired these guys. And that's true. He hired them. But the question is, who else could he have hired? You know, he campaigned against the warmongering Wall Street crowd in the Republican Party in the primaries. He campaigned against the warmongering Wall Street crowd in the Democratic Party during the election, and that's why he got elected. But who else is there? Well, there is an answer to that, and it's Lyndon LaRouche. And Trump, when he knew that the same people running Russiagate against him, Robert Mueller, the guy that was appointed back in the 1980s to run the Get LaRouche movement, who put LaRouche in prison and the rest of us, right? That same Robert Mueller was called to run the Get Trump movement, the so-called Russiagate investigation, Russian collusion investigation. And they didn't come up with any collusion. But that operation, with all of what was going on, should have proven to the president that he had one thing that had to be done, which was to exonerate Lyndon LaRouche, whom he knew to be as innocent as he was. All right? If he had done so, he would have had a whole pool of people that he could have brought into the cabinet who could have run things on the basis of the good policies that he fought for and would have corrected some of the mistakes that were made. He didn't. Is Trump going to remain an important figure in politics? I think it's the same answer. His only way he is if he decides he's going to exonerate LaRouche and go back. In his North Carolina speech, he made this stupid statement that we now know China's responsible and we should make them pay $10 trillion to bail out the world for what they did to us. What nonsense. You know, it wasn't even the virus that caused the pandemic. It was us, the same people he correctly identified as having taken down our economy. So, you know, he's going to have to make some big changes if he's going to come around. I don't think that's the most important question. The most important question is that we are here and we have an international movement, and we're going to bring them together as we have in the last several conferences, and we will again on June 26th and 27th. Scientists, political leaders, military figures, people who are going to fight to bring a modern health program to every part of the world, which is the only way to reverse this pandemic, and the whole coincidence of opposites approach. So I'll leave it at that.